Morning, everyone.
I feel so far away.
Thank you, Nick, for the warm welcome. Thank you, Oren, for stealing a bit of our time. And of course, for kicking us off in your leadership. So adolescence has changed. As a parent, it seems like many aspects of life of growing up occur at warp speed. Technology, both for good and bad, has been an impetus. Social platforms have created new opportunities to connect, but also new forms of pressure and comparison. Today we'll discuss diverse topics, including substance abuse, body image, sexual development. What is technology's role? What is mental health's role? What can we do as clinicians, health policy leaders, and most importantly, as parents? With us, our panel of doctors, physicians, therapists, with various expertise, and I'd like to let them introduce themselves.
Great, thank you so much. Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Remo. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've been on faculty at UC San Francisco for the past 6 years, where I've done research in adolescent substance abuse, primarily electronic cigarettes and cannabis. And I've recently joined Hope Lab as Director of Research Operations, where we use the human-centered design process coupled with behavioral science and technology to support adolescent health and emotional well-being.
Hi, I'm Dr. Dina Blanchard. I am a general pediatrician, and I am a partner at a practice called Premier Pediatrics with offices here in Manhattan and Brooklyn and in the Rockaways. I am very interested in mental health in general, maternal mental health, adolescent mental health, and as you can imagine, because babies grow up to be teenagers, I spend a lot of time with adolescents. So this is something that I think a lot about, and I'm really excited to talk about.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jill Daino. I'm a clinical social worker. I'm a therapist here at Talkspace, and I'm the director of the Center for Study of Anorexia and Bulimia here in New York City, and have been a therapist in private practice here in New York for 25 years.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Alexis Conason. I'm a clinical psychologist. I have a private practice here in New York where I specialize in the treatment of overeating disorders and body image concerns, and I'm also the founder of the Anti-Diet Plan, which is a mindfulness-based program to help people who are struggling with overeating and body image concerns.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Johnny Lops. I'm a psychiatrist in private practice in Manhattan and Brooklyn. I don't know if that's the best thing that I wanted to encapsulate myself, but I was one of the expert therapists on the reality series Married at First Sight. I thought I had some other really cool things I've done, but I guess I'll always be defined by that. I was an actor for 15 years here in the city. I now produce film, short films and documentaries focused on different projects that ask very interesting therapeutic questions. I'm very proud this week that we cast the first deafblind actor in a short film, the first deafblind person that's ever acted in the history of film. And we'll be starting production on that next week. So it's part of the Helen Keller Association, so we're very excited about that. I'm also on the board of director of a very exciting program in New York called New York City Cops and Kids, which helps get underserved kids off the streets. And these are boxing gyms where they have an opportunity to exercise, to minimize the risk for depression, anxiety, peer relationships, mentorship, and there's also educational opportunities there. And I'm very excited for here. Thank you guys for having me, and we're excited to talk to you guys today.
So let's jump right in. Dr. Blanchard, Dr. Lops, what are you seeing in today's adolescents, and how are problems manifesting themselves?
So I think, that being an adolescent, and I guess everyone here has been, is generally a challenging time because you're finding your identity, you're trying to figure out kind of who you are in relation to your parents. And then I think for this generation, it's become even more challenging because overall, the pressures of high school have really gone up. The pressure to kind of succeed and keep up and be doing all these after-school activities. And then you have all this social media that's coming at them. So they're basically all kind of growing up with phones and a lot of instant gratification, and also with a permanency that most current adults didn't have, where kind of, if I was a teenager and I did something really dumb, who knew? Me and the 6 people I was with, right? But nowadays, with screenshots and photos, everything kind of almost lives forever. And because adolescents' frontal lobes just are not developed in the way they're developing, and they're starting to understand abstract concepts, and they're starting to kind of improve their executive function and consequences, but they're much more likely to engage in risk-taking behaviors. They're much more likely to perhaps make a poor choice, and then when it feels much more permanent, the consequences just are multiplied for them. And so I feel like what I'm seeing a lot in my practice is a lot of increased anxiety, a lot of more depression. Those sort of tend to overlap. Some kids will try to self-medicate. So that can be in so many different ways, but with substances. And then in many ways, sometimes I find like eating disorders are used as a way of control in what feels like a completely chaotic world to these teenagers. And while, yes, that is part of teenagehood, I think it's just kind of, there's a lot of bombardment and overwhelmness and a lot of just information overload that's coming at these kids, and a lot of, okay, Dr. Deena, I just want to ask you, I Googled this, and Google said this, but my friend told me this, and then on Facebook, well, they don't use Facebook, I'm so sorry, that made me very old. And on Instagram, this person posted this, and so it's like just lots of areas of information, and their brains just really aren't designed to do that. And so the system needs to sort of change because the world we live in is changing, and so we need to kind of think about how we work with adolescents with all these added changes. Yeah. I don't know if you're saying the similar stuff.
I don't need to speak.
Oh, no.
Yeah, next question. No. I agree with everything Dr. Blanchard's saying. I'll try to just make it a little bit of a different answer. I'm seeing a lot from the challenges from a developmental model and from a two-pronged approach. That 16 to 18 group I want to talk about, and then the 22 to 24 group. That's because most kids are going away to college that are in my area, so I'm seeing these, and the consistency, the congruence that's occurring that I think is leading to those risk factors of depression, anxiety, or the utilization of substance use and eating disorders is the developmental lagging that's transpiring. I'm finding a lot of 16 to 18-year-olds where I'm telling the parents, I find like your children are more 14 to 16 in their development. However, as a system, nothing has changed that where inherently you go through K through 12, you graduate, you go to college, and when you graduate, you're supposed to enter the world. But because I'm seeing so many developmental changes or the lack of maturation of the 16 and 18-year-olds, I'm developing anxiety about sending them off to college. And there's a lot of worry from the parents because it just doesn't seem, because of social media, because of being addicted to their phones or their video games or Fortnite, right? Who's sick of hearing about Fortnite? Let's beat those guys up. That we're just seeing people not being able to develop the typical skills at that age group, whether it's dealing with conflict resolution with their peers, dating, owning and having mastery of your educational outcomes as opposed to asking your parents or other facilitators to do so. And so there's a lot of anxiety and depression as they're nearing that about the awareness and appreciation that, wow, maybe I'm not going to be ready for this next transition. Then the kids come to New York after college and they're 22, 23 and they're living alone and they come to see me and they're so paralyzed either by anxiety or depression about what they're seeing other people in their age group doing. And so what I'm seeing that's a big problem, especially in my Williamsburg practice. Williamsburg is having sort of an epidemic of everyone who thinks they're going to be famous, I think, moves to Williamsburg. So my Williamsburg practice, so these kids that come in, what are you here for? Well, I want to be a famous interior designer. Have you had a job? No. Do you have any contacts of anybody in that world? No. How are you going to do that? I don't know. And because I feel folks, because of Instagram, are so focused on the macro, they're looking for the outcome being I want to be a famous interior designer. They don't have the skills or the tools to take the small micro steps that are necessary to get there. And if I even, which comes up a lot pervasively, how about we maybe take a retail job? Retail job? That would be so beneath me. Like, I can't work for $15 to $18 an hour. And so there's this stagnation, this avoidance, this paralyzation that I'm seeing that is really difficult and honestly is not really responding to SSRIs the way that typical other generalized anxiety or panic patients have done so in the past. So it's this epidemic proportions of, as you said, like this developing brain, yet being inundated with all these outcomes and expectations.
It's so interesting that you say that because we were talking before we came out here about how often do I refer to psychologists or psychiatrists or social workers or therapists? And I was saying I refer all the time because I'm seeing the exact same thing and I'm seeing it kind of starting already at 14, 15. And I'm like, okay, you know, this is a good time to get your toolbox because life is gonna get harder, life is gonna get more complicated, and you don't have to wait till you're 30 to go to therapy. So it's kind of, I think, a really nice option to start really thinking about kind of, or even just teen support, just generally kind of like, how do I learn the skills to cope with when I'm freaking out? How do I learn the skills to cope with when my boss yells at me? You know, because these are things that are gonna happen, and I do agree with you. I think parenting, and I feel this way myself as a parent of 3 boys, parenting has changed in many ways, in good ways, and in some ways, it does create sort of a delayed developmental approach because there's just there's a lot less freedom, is what I would say, for various different kinds of reasons. And so kids are more reliant on their parents, and parents then create that, and it just is, you know? And so it's sort of, it's bigger picture, and I think it's looking at, you know, focusing on adolescence as a time where you can actually build skills and learn things, and involving the parent as well, because so much of what goes on at home, and so much, like, I mean, I can, you know what, I'll throw myself under the bus. Like, honestly, if my 15-year-old doesn't clean his room, I will probably just let myself clean it or someone else do it. Or if he doesn't put away the bowl, I'd probably just do it. Because I'm like, I'm busy, I don't wanna argue with him, I don't wanna fight with him, and I think that's different than how when I grew up, like the expectation was that I was gonna put that bowl away, and it just was. And so I think that certainly for myself, I see that kind of shift in parenting, and I talk about it with my friends also. So being a parent, being a pediatrician, kind of spanning those roles, I think that's really something to be said. I will say, though, that yesterday I told a teenager that I didn't do the Fortnite dance. I did it. I will not do it in 3-inch heels. And he was like, oh my God, you're really pretty cool for an old person, Dr. Deena. And that was it. I was like, forget it.
Thank you. Now let's get into the weeds a little bit. And Dr. Remo, can you give us an overview of the substance abuse landscape for adolescents?
Sure, that's a fun, broad question.
Yes.
And I can also get into the weeds and would be delighted to. So actually, a lot of what the 2 other people on the panel who just spoke shared about the landscape of mental health vulnerability in teens can apply to substance use today too. Some things really haven't changed that much for this generation. The developmental context of teen substance use is the same as it was in our generation and generations prior. There is a penchant toward risk-taking in adolescence, and that means that it's fairly normal to be curious about using drugs and alcohol. In fact, it's abnormal if teens don't experiment with these substances. And for some people, they will go on to have pretty serious problems with drugs and alcohol. We understand a lot about what those predictors are of who's going to have problems, and we understand how to intervene early. And a lot of that is through screening early, having primary care physicians and people who come into contact with teens, like teachers and certainly parents, be aware of what kids are likely to use. Notice when kids have, I'll call maladaptive coping strategies, if teens are experiencing a lot of stress, overwhelm, depression, anxiety, and it might be easier for them to go use substances than to do anything else to cope with their problems. So none of that is new. What is newer in this generation, this I generation, is the proliferation of new products available to teens, and also a different policy landscape than existed for us. And I'll take 2 substances that I study and think are most interesting and also challenging around teen substance use as examples of this. The first is electronic cigarettes. So vaping, which was the Webster's Dictionary word of the year in 2014, didn't exist when we were growing up. Tobacco was the big problem related to nicotine addiction. And the tobacco control movement has made great gains in reducing teen smoking. Most teens would say that they don't want to start smoking cigarettes, and they would also say if they do smoke that they wish they could quit, even if it's hard. That's really a different kind of landscape than for other drugs and alcohol. But then vaping came around, and in 2014 it was the first year that teens were more likely to vape an e-cigarette than they were to smoke a tobacco cigarette. And that spread has grown each year. And now we see products like Juul, which is the market leader in teen vaping, just taking over as a products that teens are interested in, curious about. They're advertising, it's legal. And in California, we've taken some policy steps like outlining the sale of electronic cigarette products to minors. But that has, at this point, thus far only happened at the state level. There's starting to be some more regulations on the federal level with the FDA crackdown on Juul. But until that happens, that regulatory landscape is still catching up with what is being used every day. And a lot of teens don't even know that there are nicotine in some of the products that they're using. We also know from research that if teens start with an e-cigarette, they are more likely to go on to be cigarette smokers and lifelong nicotine addicts. So we can say that fairly clearly with a number of studies at this point. The other substance I'll just mention that's a whole new world, and I kind of like to call it the Wild West, is cannabis. So when we were growing up, there was this idea that, you know, this is your brain on drugs. Any questions? And marijuana was lumped into all other drugs, cocaine, LSD, heroin, as a bad drug. It was part of the war on drugs. And my gosh, not only have we backed up from that, but we're on the entire other side of it. And in San Francisco, where retail sale of cannabis went into effect earlier this year, there were bus advertisements with huge photos of cannabis on the side of every San Francisco bus. And all kids are seeing that, teens, younger children, and that has since changed. But there's no doubt that the way kids think about cannabis is entirely different than in previous generations. So how we think about addressing the fact that this substance is likely a lot safer than Nancy Reagan was telling us it was, and yet at the same time, it means that teens likely should not be using any of these substances. And I can talk a little more about what I recommend later.
Thank you. So as you mentioned, the Nancy Reagan era, I think to growing up, and for me, I remember the Cosby Show, which is definitely not politically correct anymore. But I only had the ability to see people on TV, to see people in person. Now adolescents can see and emulate people from all over the world. How has this affected young adults in terms of body image? I'm going to address this to Dr. Conason and then Jill.
So I think that this has definitely affected the way that kids, teens, and actually all of us, to be honest, think about body image because, you know, as you mentioned, when we were growing up, it used to be just you compared yourself with your peers, your classmates or people that you passed on the street or whatnot. But now we're comparing ourselves with all these people on social media and people that we feel like we know, but we don't really know, celebrities and influencers and things like that. And what we're seeing are these very highly curated images that are designed to kind of mimic everyday life. So we see an image, there was a Instagram post that came out, I don't know, maybe a year ago with Kim Kardashian, and it was this selfie. And they had one image that was just her with the selfie, and then there was another image that was like a wide shot of the scene. And it had her makeup artist and her hairstylist and her lighting person, and there's like a whole team behind that. And I think that it's really confusing to kids because they don't see that these images are not just a spur-of-the-moment, spontaneous selfie that somebody took in the midst of their day, but they're these really planned out and curated images. And then, of course, the other thing that we're seeing a lot of is the photoshopping and the face tuning and, you know, the apps that will actually alter what people look like. So these images that people are comparing themselves to, they're not even real. That's not even what the people really look like. And one final thing is the use of the sponsorships, which I think has been really confusing for teens and for adults, is that when an influencer, so taking Kim Kardashian again for another example, she posted an image over the summer that was her eating a lollipop, and it was an appetite suppressant lollipop. And there was no mention that this was a paid product, that this was a paid sponsorship. So, kids scrolling through see Kim Kardashian likes these appetite suppressant lollipops, and they like Kim Kardashian, so they should get those lollipops too. And, no one is telling them that there is, lots and lots of money that's behind trying to make them feel that they need to change their body by losing weight, by, being convinced that they're not good enough because people are trying to sell them something. So I think that's been really confusing in social media, and I think it's something that, we need to do better on in terms of how kids are comparing ourselves and, teaching kids to be critical consumers.
Well, echoing a lot of what Alexis just said, one of the things that I know we talked about previously, France actually has done something along those lines, and any image that has been enhanced, photoshopped, filtered in their advertising has to be labeled as such. Now, as you can imagine, if that happened here, it would be almost any image we see. The thing that would be amazing about that is how do we as critical consumers, even as adults, we as adults get fooled, and you look at something. You look around this room, there's all kinds of people, all kinds of bodies and shapes and images and hair color and eye color and skin. You open a magazine or you go on Instagram, everybody's skin is like even, like there's not a mark. How's that possible? But if you're 13 or 16 or 8 or 21 and you're new to the city from Topeka and you want to make it as that interior designer in Williamsburg, for those of you that aren't from here, it's like a hip place to live. You're not filtering that. And I think that's really the danger, is they're not filtering, they're not being taught with a critical eye as a critical consumer of media. What is their digital literacy? I have a 9-year-old son, and his school actually teaches digital literacy. And they teach it to the parents, but they teach it as part of curriculum. And it has to do with safety, but it also has to do with being a literate consumer. And I think that speaks to whether it's images or also where are you getting your information. When somebody wants to have a vegetarian diet, but then it's an animal rights group sponsoring the website, like where are you getting your information? So I think it speaks to a broader kind of construct of how do we teach people to take in information in a critical way, and roles of pediatricians, roles of therapists, and roles of family in school.
The challenge that I see is teaching people, but also people seeking out information themselves, especially young people. For example, when I was thinking of questions for this, so I did a little bit of Google research and I came across pro-ana sites. Yeah. Would either of you like to talk a little bit about what that is and how you see that having an effect on adolescents?
Well, there's pro and cons to any of those. Pro-ana sites have been around for quite some time. You can track those back. They're sort of like cockroaches in New York City. You kill one, 10 more pop up. You and I were talking earlier today about this. There are some aspects of them that in a certain way have a positive aspect because it does create community. The downside is it can create negative community because it's positively reinforcing pro-anorexia behaviors, giving each other tips of how to, lose more weight, sharing images of things that are fostering anorexic behaviors, anorexic body images, how to eat cotton balls so you'll feel full, like the tips that we don't need. At the same time, there are communities where they can help inspire people to get help. They're also being countered with messages of getting help. So the flip is there are more and more, I saw something recently, the flip of that is a woman is on Instagram right now. She created something called I Weigh. Have you seen her? Yeah, it's great, right? Because she was sick of seeing women's body weights being like a thing, like famous women posting their body weights. So instead, she has one called I Weigh, and it says something like mother, sister, skateboarder, blogger, and all the things that you are as a person. And that's what you weigh, like who are you as a person, and really changing the dialogue. So I think with pro-ana sites, my hope is they've lessened over the years. They were really a thing when it was more straight up internet. With social media, I think it's shifted. I think the thinspo on Instagram and fitspo and thinspo I see much more now than I see pro-ana. And those I don't love because it's in the guise of fitness.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that what we're seeing more of is, I think we're seeing less of the pro-ana sites, which was maybe 5-10 years ago. But what we're seeing a lot of is this kind of health culture, which is really promoting eating disorders. It's kind of taken the place of, strong is the new skinny, and it's been one, kind of unrealistic demand on our bodies replaced by another. So now we see a lot of these, health and fitness bloggers promoting eating disordered behaviors. There was a research study that came out looking at these health bloggers, and I forget exactly what the number was, but some huge percentage of the information that they're promoting is actually eating disordered behaviors. So I think that we've seen, unfortunately, I'd say the problem is still there. It's just kind of taken a different form. But I think on the positive side is that social media has really allowed the proliferation of a lot of activism movements and body positivity and the health at every size movement, and really amazing things that we've seen that have allowed for healing from eating disorders and for people to see more diverse images and pictures of bodies that look like theirs, and women who are saying, men and women who are saying, I'm not trying to change my body's beautiful just as it is, the fat acceptance movement as well. So I think there's also really powerful, amazing things happening that I don't think would be possible without social media. So.
And if I could just add, I'm finding myself using the word orthorexia more in my practice than I am anorexia. And for everyone who doesn't know, orthorexia is sort of the condition where you're obsessed with how fit you are, and in a way that certain people, the healthy eating. And there are a gamut of people who are typically successful people, go-getters type A, but instead of substituting maybe cocaine at night and being club kids, they're getting up in the morning and doing these things called like Barry's Boot Camp and Rumble, and for you, Barry's Boot Camp. Soul Cycle. And I'm having the folks in my practice, and they're just obsessing about Instagram pages of like their favorite. And my wife's not here, right? But my wife, her favorite celebrity is this woman named Karen in Williamsburg. She's a Soul Cycle instructor, and she's like, if I just had more time, I'd work with Karen, because she judges herself on how hard she can work within these classes. And so that's what these folks are doing. They're comparing themselves based on can you do a Karen class? And that's like their new
those
addiction.
Soul Cycle instructors are famous.
They're famous. These people are actually becoming famous, and they're judging each other based on who can work through such and such instructor. Oh, you just did a James class? That's what people will say.
It's very competitive.
And then they'll come in and be like, I had a kid come in 2 weeks ago, and he's like, I couldn't get through Karen's class. What's happened to me? I think I have to go to Austria and pay. I told me went to Austria and paid $15,000 last week for a cleanse because he just wasn't able to get through it. And so from an eating disorders point of view, for you clinicians, make sure you don't forget to ask about orthorexia, about their obsessions in that domain.
Yeah. Well, the overexercise piece is a huge piece of it.
Because we're so excited about folks exercising.
Right. Where's the line between fitness
Yeah.
and when does it cross?
Yep.
There is a parallel process happening in the substance use world where talking about sponsorship, and there are industries behind teen substance use now in a totally new and different way than there were just a generation ago. So the tobacco industry and the alcohol industries have been around for a long time. The vaping industry and the newfound cannabis industry is pouring tons of money into marketing their products. And a lot of the outlets that they're marketing on are youth-consumed media, social media, YouTube. So that's been a huge force to be reckoned with in the substance use world. And then another way that social media is enhancing teens' exposure to substances is through you did a Google search today to find out more about what we would be talking about. So do teens when they're curious about how to use something or something that they've heard about that might be new and different. And experts in, let's say, dabbing are found on Reddit. If you have a question, you go onto a Reddit board, ask it, and it's going to be anyone who answers that question. It's not necessarily going to be a mental health professional or a physician. So how can we combat all of that and use social media and other platforms to actually deliver evidence-based information, teach teens, which I argue is similar across all areas of mental health, to be savvy consumers of what they're seeing on social media.
So Dr. Blanchard, my 12-year-old, I think, is a teenager. My 10-year-old, I'm sure, is a teenager.
I know her, she's a teenager.
My 7-year-olds are getting pretty close, and my 3-year-old is not quite there yet. So I have one left. How do we start these conversations? When do we start these conversations? And what do we do as parents?
Yeah, and so I think this actually brings up a really important point that is something that I try to overcome with the parents in my practice, is that talking about something does not lead to that behavior. And people are really afraid of that. So if I talk about sexuality or sex or drug use and that kind of stuff, then my kid will just want to go try it. But studies show over and over again that that's not in fact the case. And actually there was a study that just came out about the HPV vaccine where people will be like, well, if I give my child the HPV vaccine, that's going to make them engage in riskier sexual behaviors, which is not true. And so over and over, what you find is actually talking to kids, being upfront, being honest with them, speaking to them and meeting them kind of at their developmental level is preventative. And creating situations where they can empower themselves to make choices is preventative as well. And so it's this kind of building of mutual respect where parents are open and honest with children, and then children can then be open and honest without judgment from parents, and same within the healthcare system. So your pediatrician plays a huge role in that. And I really do recommend starting to talk to kids at a very early age. So if you're starting to talk to kids about sexuality at 14, you've probably missed the boat, and they've heard, or you have missed the boat, and they've heard a lot from their friends. And so I would say not exactly, so you're obviously not going to speak to a 7-year-old like you're going to speak to a 14-year-old, and you're going to start conversations that then continue. And I really feel that open-ended sort of ways of going about it is a good way to go. And so one of the questions I get asked all the time is, how do I talk to my child about puberty? And so I always say, well, maybe you could start by asking them what they already know, depending on the age, because on the school bus, it's the Wild West. And your kids are hearing all sorts of things, words and ideas and stuff. And so if you're there from the beginning saying, okay, you can come to me with questions, come to me with what you're open about, and your pediatrician is then promoting that same idea, it creates, I think, two comfortable spaces, your medical home and your home. And then schools would be another place where that's happening also. And so, I mean, the idea of that it takes a village, in this day and age, you are very fragmented most of the time from your family. You're not living with your aunts and your sisters and your cousins and all those people. And so your village are your friends, but they're also your healthcare professionals and your educators. And it needs to start where everybody really partners together, and the expectation isn't that just one part of that picture is going to be the way this gets solved. And I think that's part of what's awesome about this conference is that there are these talks, this is happening. And so my messaging to parents, and I continue this at all the well visits, is speak to your kids early, ask them if they have any questions. I also really feel that once kids can start, even 3-year-olds, answer the questions to the doctor. So you don't want to speak for your child, let your child speak. Obviously, you're not going to be obnoxious about it, but I'll often come in and talk to the child first and then talk to the parents. And then I always start, even at 3, what was something that you liked that you did today? What was something great that you did today and you're proud of? And sort of creating and modeling that as a physician so that then that goes home to parents. And then I mean, for the body image thing, because I see what happens often is around 10 or 11, kids like to see same-sex doctors. They feel more comfortable. So I see a lot of preteen, teenage girls, and I talk a lot about, and that puberty thing always comes up, and the parents are like always grateful for me to kind of jump in and help with that conversation, but a lot about not comparing yourself to other people, because particularly with body image, you can see a 10-year-old who has had her period and is done with puberty, and then 10-year-olds that haven't even started to go through puberty. And so my kind of messaging, and I think parents can say the same thing, is everybody's body is different. If you're worried, my job is to promise you that if something's wrong, I will tell you. Your job is to come ask me. If you're worried, ask me, ask your mom. Come to us, you can ask us anything you want, and just a lot of that reassurance. And I think with adolescents, I mean, there are laws that protect their health privacy, but just kind of reaffirming that when you're talking to them, and that they know that they can go talk to people at school or their physician or other people without the risk that I'm gonna like call their mom and be like, hey, just wanna let you know, that kind of stuff. And they feel a lot better when, particularly if they'll disclose something, and then I'll say, okay, let's think about how to talk to your parents about this. Can we talk to your parents about this way? And then that's great for the parents because it's a little more open. I know that was kind of broad, but I think it's kind of a place to start in terms of a culture shift of thinking about how we parent, how we educate, and how we are pediatricians.
Dr. Remo, what should we be doing differently for substance abuse, perhaps on a more larger scale, on a policy scale, on a corporate stewardship scale?
Well, there's no doubt to prevent teen substance use, it's ideal to have regulations starting as high as the federal level. We're starting to see that with vaping and e-cigarettes, with the FDA really cracking down on Juul quite recently and on e-cigarettes more broadly. They're recognizing that teens are using these substances, and that if they don't do something, it could lead to the next generation of tobacco smokers and having all of the gains that we made in the tobacco control movement just lost, and that would be a terrible shame, and more people would die. So to the extent that things can be regulated, it's the best case scenario. Cannabis is a whole other area. It is as, quote, regulated as possible in that it is a Schedule I substance federally. We can't even acknowledge that cannabis has any medical properties in terms of its FDA classification, such that research even determines whether cannabis can help people for any reason. That really complicates the market, especially at the state level. And so it allows for states to legalize cannabis, have that come into direct conflict with the classification of this substance federally, and the market is entirely open. So it's up for states who are legalizing cannabis medically and recreationally to enforce not selling their products to those under 21. And if we do that well, that will mean that fewer teens will be using cannabis, even if more adults are using cannabis. And I would argue that that would be a good thing, and legalization could prevent more problems with cannabis use in this country if it's done right. We're having that experiment now in California, and we'll see what happens. But in the bills that are making policy more and more liberal around cannabis use in this country, there needs to be some consideration of the public health effects of more liberal policy. So cracking down on driving while high, cracking down on whether young people under 21 will have access to these substances, and cracking down on things that make it more likely that teens will use these substances. Flavors, and that goes for electronic cigarettes and cannabis. Advertising, where advertising can happen, how it can happen. What happens when it is determined that companies are advertising their products on teen-consumed media? What happens when flavors are so clearly there for children? My personal favorite flavor is unicorn poop, which is a beautiful rainbow unicorn with, I think, blue feces that I can't imagine a 60-year-old person who's been smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day for a number of decades would ever be interested in using. Teens, on the other hand, might be curious. So stopping that immediately and forcefully is of utmost importance.
I'm going to turn to Jill and Dr. Conason. In your respective expertise, what would you like to see changed?
I mean, from a policy standpoint, I'd love to see what France does here with the labeling on images, and at least in advertising, at least starting there, that they have been enhanced, photoshopped, changed. So at least in a magazine or a TV ad or an Instagram ad, at least on that level, people would be aware that it has been altered. That would be a good start.
So I'm going to actually think a little bit bigger even than just the regulatory piece, because I think that what we need to really create a shift around eating disorders and body image is a dramatic change in our culture. I think that we need to work to create a world where we're valued for more than just what we look like, where a diversity of different body sizes is accepted, where we're not pathologizing certain types of bodies and teaching our girls and our women and our men too often that we have to be smaller in order to be better, in order to be valued, in order to be respected and loved. Because that is the climate that is going to foster eating disorders and massive body dissatisfaction. And it's epidemic, really. Statistics are like 91% of women are dissatisfied with our bodies. 97% of women have at least one thought about hating their body every single day. So to me, that's a cultural problem. That is something that is in the air that we're breathing in. And I think we really need to change it so we don't pass it down to our next generation of kids. And again, there's amazing work being done in the body positivity movement and the health at every size and fat acceptance movements. And I think that the more that we can expose our children to the idea that all bodies are good bodies and that diversity is the beauty of life, I think we're going to go a long ways. But it's so ingrained in our culture. I think we have a lot of work to do to get there.
I want to close with a final brief question for Drs. Blanchard and Lops. What's the one thing you'd like to see happen within the next 3 years that's going to address some of these problems on a granular level?
Well, I was actually going to say that I think that already one of the nice things that transpired already 2 weeks ago, or I'm sorry, in August, was that New York State mandated and signed a law that Cuomo had signed that mandated that all schools now from K through 12 have a mental health series of lectures at the state level, and that's already been implemented this year. So I think that's something that's been very helpful. But I think at the very micro level that one of the things that we need to speak to is us as parents. That's how I want to finish with today, is that before kids go to the social media to get more of their engagements, before they are looking at advertisements, the non-verbal interactions we have with our children when we're not just actively parenting, I think will play a large part in this next generation. If you yourself know that you tend to have anxiety, if whenever there's a moment with you hear about a teacher and you get utterly chaotic, you're only modeling for the child that whenever there's a distress moment, they should get chaotic themselves. And if there is a part of your household where you speak about not being good enough, or, for example, seriously, in my household where my wife and I are both actively marathon runners and can be prone to that, we've already had these conversations that we have to be mindful of the way we discuss with our son about his academic accolades or his athletic accolades. If we use terminology like, you weren't fast enough, or why did you run so poorly, we're already internalizing in his mind that there might be something negativism about himself, which then when he becomes a teen, that's only going to be fostered and matured, where he's only going to look for other ways that validate that he's never good enough, which then perpetuates video game addiction and substance use and whatnot. So I think my leaving message for today is for all of us to think about our own micro emotional management of own depression, anxiety, and how we're displacing that into our children when we get dysregulated, because whatever they see is whatever we distill is what they're going to see as a way to operate, and then we're only identifying that there's a plethora of more ways that they can perpetuate and feed into the social media as a result of what we're instilling in them as parents.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I agree that there needs to be a lot of education around, and and as a parent, it is a challenge to be mindful of the words you say, and even praise, for example. You don't want to just be like, you're awesome. Like, you want to say kind of, I loved how hard you worked at drawing that picture. It's so beautiful. But that is hard. That is a shift. That's not the world that most people grew up in. And so for me, I think if I'm gonna have to go with, I'm gonna pick two things, sorry, Neil. One of them is I really feel while there is a decrease in stigma around mental health issues, it is not enough. And if you have a parent who's highly anxious and then is bringing that into their home and they are not comfortable getting care for themselves because they're worried about, and I see this all the time in the postpartum period, they're worried, okay, well, if I don't look like I'm rainbows, lollipops, and sunshine on Instagram and everything's great, what does that mean about me? So they're struggling with the same messages, like, you know, I agree with you, they're struggling with the same messages as the teens, but it's not anyone's fault, it's a bigger cultural issue. So I feel like the more people stand up and say, it is okay to be anxious. If someone had diabetes, we would not yell at their pancreas and say, make more insulin, come on, pancreas, you could do better. It's the same thing with mental health issues. And I really feel that so strongly. And same thing, so I always say, like, I can't yell at my eyes to see better. If your child is anxious, if your child has ADHD, if your child has depression, they can't yell at their brain to be different. It needs help. And it needs to be seen in the same, when we can see mental health illnesses as the same way that we see diabetes and cancer and ear infections and strep throat, that will be a huge change for this country. The second thing is access to care. It is extremely expensive to see therapists in New York City. And that is where the access is available. In other parts of the country, you might not have a child psychiatrist for 100 miles. So where are these people supposed to get care? And I think, so if I were gonna choose two things, since I can't follow the rules and pick one, I would say we really need to work on public people speaking out, ending the stigma, showing the reality of what is happening in life, and then finding a way to create, once we have are establishing that people are actually open and willing to get help, having the ability to actually get that, because that is definitely something that we struggle with.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank all our panelists for joining us and really giving us a lot to chew on and think about, both in my role with Talkspace and as a parent. Thank you.